Merci beaucoup, Tina. Bonjour tout le monde. Merci d'être avec nous en si grand nombre aujourd'hui. Vraiment un beau turnout pour utiliser un anglicisme dès le début de la conversation. On est très excités de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour cette conversation avec la société civile canadienne. Monsieur le ministre, comme vous êtes très familier avec le réseau Action Climat et ses membres, Climate Action Network Canada and its members and allies are really the ones who are not only at the forefront of advocating for the climate transition, but also the ones who are implementing climate action back home. And you'll hear directly from them really what is top of mind for them as we really start this COP. So thank you so much for being here. Just before we go, I wanted to share a little bit of context on how CAN is seeing the moment that we're in, which is really a critical moment. Climate multilateralism is not only more needed than ever, but it's also more at risk than ever. Not only because a climate denier was just elected as a US president, but also because we're seeing growing geopolitical tensions. We're seeing genocide across the world in Gaza, Sudan, and Congo. And all of this is playing into the tensions between global north and global south that really are at the core of the slowly but surely eroding trust that we've seen in global negotiations. And all of this is taking place during the hottest year ever. And I think everyone in this room can now say that we have lived experience of climate change with wildfires in Canada, but also heat waves, floods that are touching us and impacting our homes, our communities, and our health. And we are also seeing this combination of increasing risk, but also importance more than ever related to climate action back home, with the rise of climate denialism and of populist politicians, often propped up by the fossil fuel lobby, who are not only delaying and diluting existing climate efforts, but sometimes even pushing for backtracking. And so that is the context within which we come to COP this year. I wanted to share, just before I pass it over to you, the main priorities for CAN, and obviously you'll hear a lot more detail from our amazing members during this conversation. But as you can imagine, this year we're here fighting the mother of all fights, finance, with the negotiation of the new collective quantified goal, which we're expecting to be just, to be ambitious, and to really reflect the needs of developing countries. We're also at a moment where we need to see the historic outcome that was achieved at COP last year on the transition away from fossil fuels to be secured not only in NDCs for 2035, but also in some of the negotiation streams. Specifically for us, the Just Transition is really important. The Just Transition Work Program is really important as a key space for enabling climate action. And finally, we're hoping to see adaptation as an issue be elevated, because it's not getting the attention it deserves in those spaces. I've talked a lot, so I'll pass it over to you to hear your priorities, Canada's priorities, and expectations for this COP.
Merci beaucoup, Caroline. Merci, Tina, pour l'introduction. Merci à vous toutes et tous d'être ici. Ça me fait vraiment plaisir de me joindre à vous aujourd'hui. Caroline, tu parlais en introduction de le moment, à quel point c'est un moment important. Je ne sais pas si on peut parler de célébration, mais l'an prochain, ça va faire 30 ans que je participe aux négociations internationales sur le climat. Donc, j'étais à la première conférence à Berlin en 1995. Alors, et je pense que je suis tout à fait d'accord avec toi et avec vous que c'est un moment qui est très important dans les négociations pour plusieurs raisons. Certainement, l'an passé, à Dubaï, on a fait une percée historique avec, pour la première fois dans presque 30 ans de négociations, un accord sur la réduction de la dépendance aux hydrocarbures. Pour certains, c'était pas suffisant, mais c'était quand même du jamais vu dans le cadre des négociations. And this year we have the collective tremendous task of agreeing on a new international quantified goal for finance. So clearly, I think our priorities overlap, both in terms of the implementation of what came out of the global stocktake last year, and certainly on the issue of finance this year. I will add perhaps another element that is a priority for us, both in this forum, but also as we come out of Cali, COP16, and where the Government of Canada worked closely with the Assembly of First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit and many of our international partners, certainly including Colombia and others, to ensure that we were able to finalize the creation of a permanent Indigenous body within the CBD, and we take our responsibility towards reconciliation seriously domestically, and we're certainly taking it seriously internationally, and we want to work with our Indigenous partners to see how we can do everything we can as a responsible partner to them here in this forum to try and advance with them their priorities in a number of different streams. I'll say a couple of things maybe on finance, and maybe pass it back over to you. So as many of you would know, Canada, alongside Germany, played I would say an important role between COP26 and COP28. So we were asked by 3 consecutive COP presidency to help on the delivery of the $100 billion goal. And I think we've learned, not just us, but collectively, I think we've learned a number of things. So I don't know how many of you were in Copenhagen in 2009 when the $100 billion goal was, agreed would be a big word. It was kind of a rabbit that was pulled out of the hat in the last few hours of the conference, without too much thought given to, okay, well, what are we talking about here? What are the sources? What are the mechanisms? What about access? Is this the right amount? And the fact that we didn't really ask ourselves those questions then haunted us, I would argue, to this day. And now we have a chance of doing things differently, in a better way, to try and figure out and have those discussions about, okay, what is the right amount or amounts? What about, we didn't talk a lot in the previous goal about the quality of the financing around grants, concessional finance, and things like that. And certainly we didn't put a whole lot of thinking into access. And as not only on our work with Germany, but last year, as many of you would know, I co-facilitated with Minister Fouad from Egypt, the working group on finance in Dubai. And that's one thing we've heard loud and clear, the issue of access. So for us, it needs to be a package. Like all those elements, it's not enough to have a number if we don't put a lot of thinking into those other important elements. So I'll stop here. I know people have questions and politicians can talk a lot, so I'll try not to do that today.
Thanks so much for that, Minister, and I think we'll dive right into it. And first, I do want to say that we really hear you on quality and access being important elements that we value and prioritize as well. So yeah, speaking about the new goal, I will be going to Gaia Fer du réseau Action Climat France et aussi une ancienne membre du réseau Action Climat Canada pour nous commencer la discussion sur les attentes de la société civile sur ce que le Canada peut faire dans les négociations, précisément sur le nouvel objectif.
Est-ce que vous m'entendez correctement? Parfait. Comme vous l'avez bien souligné en début de conversation, en fait, on va devoir négocier ce nouvel objectif collectif quantifié. Et sans ça, il va devenir très compliqué, s'il n'est pas assez élevé, de réussir le chemin vers les nouvelles contributions nationales déterminées, notamment. Et au niveau de notre position du réseau international, on est sur un 1 trillion, 1000 milliards essentiellement sur base de dons ou dons équivalents, parce qu'en effet, la qualité est essentielle pour éviter d'alimenter la crise de la dette. Et on se demande justement ce que peut porter le Canada, poussé pour arriver à avoir un quantum assez élevé, une qualité de la finance au cœur des réflexions et également des sous-objectifs, parce qu'on a besoin de financement pour l'atténuation, l'adaptation et les pertes et dommages. Merci beaucoup.
Merci pour la question. Donc, évidemment, nous avons eu et nous allons continuer d'avoir beaucoup de conversations au cours des derniers mois avec plusieurs de nos partenaires sur ces questions-là. Quand je parlais de soit un montant ou plusieurs montants, je pense qu'il faut certainement, la question du financement gouvernemental public doit rester au cœur de cette discussion-là et de l'accord. Je pense qu'il n'y a pas de débat là-dessus et je pense également qu'il faut que le chiffre soit plus élevé que ce que nous avons fait. Et il faut aussi reconnaître qu'on ne peut pas y arriver juste avec le financement public. On a demandé, le Canada, comme bien d'autres pays du Nord, ont doublé leur contribution lors de la dernière période. Certainement, je ne peux pas parler au nom des autres, mais au nom du Canada, je travaille beaucoup au niveau national pour qu'on puisse augmenter encore notre contribution en 2035, pour 2035, dont l'annonce sera faite l'an prochain. Je ne sais pas encore où nous allons atterrir, mais je pense qu'on doit regarder d'autres éléments aussi. Par exemple, le rôle des organes multilatéraux. Et hier, nous avons une rencontre avec les gens du Climate Investment Fund. Et, par exemple, lorsqu'ils réussissent à mobiliser des fonds, ils estiment que pour $1 investi, ils sont capables d'aller chercher $7 de plus. Alors, je pense qu'on doit tenir compte de ces éléments-là, puis on doit aussi tenir compte de comment l'argent public peut aider à faire la même chose. C'est vrai au Canada, c'est vrai au niveau international. Et il faut aussi être conscient que différents types de financement vont pouvoir financer différentes choses. Je suis bien conscient que le financement du secteur privé peut difficilement aller à la question d'adaptation et encore moins aux pertes et préjudices. Mais il y a un rôle pour le secteur privé dans tout ce qui est transition énergétique, décarbonation, et il faut trouver de meilleures façons de mettre le secteur privé à contribution. Et lorsqu'on regarde les études que l'OCDE a fait au cours des dernières années, le financement, dans le cadre du 100 milliards, le financement public était pas mal à la hauteur de ce qu'on anticipait. Le financement des organes multilatéraux également. Et c'est le financement privé où on a connu plus de difficultés. Et là, je pense qu'il ne faut pas se le cacher non plus. Là, on risque de perdre un contributeur public très, très, très important. Alors, il faut tenir compte de ça dans ce qu'on estime être capable de mobiliser en termes de fonds publics et comment, je ne dis pas que parce qu'on doit tenir compte de ça, on doit être moins ambitieux, mais comment est-ce qu'on trouve des solutions à cette épineuse question-là?
Merci, Monsieur le ministre, pour cette réponse détaillée. Je sais que vous êtes attendu en plénière pour donner la déclaration tantôt, so I would like to ask both speakers and the minister to try to keep it succinct so that we hear from the most amount of people possible. Samy, de la Fédération des travailleurs et travailleuses du Québec, a également une question sur les liens entre finance et transition juste.
Oui, bonjour M. le ministre, merci beaucoup de participer à cet événement. Alors, ma question est la suivante. Étant donné le manque quand même significatif de lien entre le programme de travail sur la transition juste et le texte sur le financement climatique lors des négociations actuelles, particulièrement l'absence de langage qualitatif et substantiel dans le nouvel objectif collectif quantifié, quelles mesures spécifiques, vous et votre équipe de négociation, allez-vous prendre à la COP29 pour remédier à cette lacune qui assure et assurer que le Canada plaide pour une intégration plus ambitieuse des principes de transition juste dans les engagements de financement climatique?
Merci pour la question. Deux choses que je dirais là-dessus rapidement. Bon, d'abord, le Canada est très favorable à ces éléments-là, puisque nous travaillons à les mettre en œuvre au niveau national par le projet de loi qui a été adopté par mes collègues Wilkinson et Oregon sur qu'on appelle au Canada les emplois durables, ce qu'on appelle ici la transition juste, d'une part, mais comme vous le savez également, au Canada, nous lions, par exemple, les crédits d'impôt pour les investissements dans les technologies propres, les projets d'énergie renouvelable, à des emplois de travailleurs syndiqués. Alors, pour nous, il y a donc la capacité d'une entreprise à recevoir des crédits d'impôt plus généreux est liée à sa performance par rapport au travail, aux travailleurs et notamment aux travailleurs syndiqués. Et ce sont certainement des choses que l'équipe de négociation ici fait valoir auprès de nos collègues internationaux et auprès des Nations Unies. On va voir maintenant jusqu'où on peut aller, mais c'est certainement des éléments que le Canada défend avec bonheur et enthousiasme.
Merci, Monsieur le ministre. Merci, Yaya Samy. On va maintenant on a parlé des positions de négociation du Canada, but Canada also has to contribute both in its efforts at home and in the finance that it provides to doing its fair share of the global effort to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And so the question is, what's Canada's role in implementation in all of this? And so I'll pass it over to Joy Kennedy from the Canadian Interfaith Fast for the Climate and also chair of the CAN-Rac board to tell us about how we're conceptualizing Canada's fair share and ask you a question.
Thank you. First, I want to take my cap off to you, my emissions cap off to you, in respect if you keep your promises. And beginning my question on Canada's fair share by acknowledging that we landed the $100 billion and increased Canada's pledge quite considerably. So we acknowledge that for those actions. Thank you. But now it's important to build upon those efforts exponentially. You know, as we all know, the climate crisis intensifies and there's no clear path forward without ramping up both mitigation and massively increasing our international financial contributions. So for several years, CAN-Rac has calculated and advocated for a quantified version of what that entails. But sadly, that target hasn't been included in Canada's NDC. So we ask why and why not? What stands in the way of exercising our clear moral, ethical, and promised obligation as a wealthy fossil fuel country, and one that produces more emissions, although they're going down, but the effect that has on catastrophic climate impacts that are happening around the world. We hope that CAN-Rac's proposed document paving the way for an equitable future, which I'm sure you've seen and read and inwardly digested.
Inside out.
Inside out, yeah. That will be considered in the development of a new, more ambitious NDC. Now you may plan 1/4, 1/5, but this will take a major lift. But we can afford our fair share. We are convinced the resources needed are available through such things as removing fossil fuel subsidies, taxing obscene windfall profits, and many other possibilities. So polling indicates that at least 2/3 of Canadians think that the government must do more on climate change, climate action. What will you do and when? As Canada takes on the presidency of the G7, this new NDC provides a perfect opportunity to actually demonstrate ambitious and principled leadership that can begin to turn the tide toward justice and fairness, to build trust and hope for a sustainable future. And how do you plan to do that?
Thank you very much, Joy. I mean, you're the only face I'm seeing here who was there in Copenhagen in 2009. Perhaps there are others, and my apologies if I don't. Oh, Joanna was there, of course, yes. My dear Chief of Staff. I mean, in addition to what I said earlier about mobilizing fund, I think we need to be looking at things like debt relief, and Canada certainly supports that. And it's not a contribution in direct money to countries, but it's certainly a way to help them in putting in place measures, adapting to the impacts of climate change. I have read your document. I have met with many of you about this. You've met many of my colleagues. So this is an ongoing conversation within the government. As we're being asked by the Paris Agreement, we will be presenting our. I mean, we have to determine our target, our domestic target, by December 1st, and we have to present our NDCs roughly in the first quarter of next year. We're trying to take a bit of a different approach to our NDCs this time, looking not only at what we need to do on climate, but also nature, because following COP15, we now have commitments on nature, and hopefully by the end of next week, we will have more commitments on plastic pollution. So instead of just looking at our NDCs and frankly, I mean, there are many links between all these three elements, and we're trying to stop looking at those in silos. So it's not a done deal, but I am advocating for a higher financial contribution by Canada. I need your help. I need your advocacy, your energy, and I need you to keep socializing this with as many people as possible within my government.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Just a reminder, Joy is theoretically my boss, so she didn't respect my instructions, but please keep your questions short. Sumin from CAN-Rac has a question on the financial component of the fair share.
You've already spoken to this a little bit, but since 2021 to 2026, Canada had committed $5.3 billion in climate financing, but we also know that makes up only 59% of Canada's fair share of climate financing. And climate and development organizations across the country have been calling for the tripling of climate financing. So what can we expect Canada to signal to ensure that it's actually meeting the quality and the quantity needed for climate financing for post-2025?
Can you specify what you mean by signal? Like, do you mean what we'll be announcing next year, or? Yes.
Yes. So can we expect Canada to actually deliver to ensure that it's working towards meeting its fair share of climate financing, and how can we ensure that the quality actually meets the needs?
So I think I've touched on many elements of your question previously. The conversation is ongoing, so I don't know is the honest answer what our share will be, and will it be fair, and we're working to try and achieve those goals. We are doing a lot of work on the other elements as well. So beyond the quantum, the quality, certainly doing a lot of work with many institutions, including in Canada, for example, FinDev, on being able to provide more and more concessional finance for the Global South, and also the issue of access. And I think we won't be successful unless we can make progress, both internationally and domestically, on those three elements.
Thank you, Minister.
I would love to be in a position to tell you what it's going to be, but I don't know, because we haven't finalized those conversations. Which doesn't mean that we may not have a very interesting financial announcement in the coming days, but not the NDC.
Intriguing.
Stay tuned.
One key way in which Canada can not only implement what will be discussed here, but also contribute to driving an ambitious outcome is in its signaling as future G7 host. And so Alex Scott from ECHO, Italy's foremost climate think tank, has a question on this.
Thanks very much. And, hi, sorry for not standing.
No, not at all. Not at all.
But I wanted to reflect on the fact that Canada will be picking up the presidency of the G7 from Italy this year.
Yes.
Some progress was made over the last year, so this year's kind of delivery and some gaps we definitely left behind. How can Canada use the G7 next year to rally the other countries of the G7? I'm particularly thinking about the US, difficult politically, but beyond the US, how can Canada rally the other G7 countries to prove that the G7 are delivering on the promises they've made to deliver climate action at home? I'm thinking about their NDCs, their commitments to end coal, to end fossil fuel subsidies, but also prove that the G7 are genuine partners with developing countries investing in their transitions. We'd love to hear what you think Canada could achieve, and particularly how Italy can partner with Canada and how we as civil society can help make the G7
Yes. I think there are many elements to your question. One of my priorities for this week is to meet with as many representatives from the Global South as possible. I'm meeting a number of CARICOM ministers later, finance minister from the Marshall Islands, participating in leaders event tomorrow with SIDS and African countries. And it's obviously to discuss what is happening here, but also how can we use our G7 presidency next year, coming out of this COP, and hopefully with an agreement on NCQG, and how can we move that into implementation. Coming out of Brazil, G20 presidency this year, and their COP30 presidency next year, as well as South Africa's presidency for the G20. So I think that this G7 is at an interesting nexus. And you spoke about what happens south of the border, clearly something that we will need to compose with. But and the Prime Minister, myself, and many of my colleagues are very engaged and very keen on seeing how we can use that G7 presidency to advance climate priorities, and certainly from a Canadian perspective, an international nature, plastics, and as well as Indigenous reconciliation, which is a very high priority for the Canadian government.
Merci. All of this that is being discussed in those international fora and that ultimately kind of drives the agenda nationally needs to be brought back home and implemented into provincial, local, Indigenous, but also federal policy. And we're going to talk about federal policy given that the conversation is with you. And so we have a couple questions about that. And to start us off, we'll hand it over to Sarah Hansen of Indigenous Climate Action.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you both. Canada has done a great job at indigenizing climate policy through projects like the Indigenous Leadership Initiative and the Indigenous Guardians Program. However, when we look at truly decolonizing climate policies, we're often still waiting for a rightful seat at the table as Indigenous peoples, or we're left without the power to enact our rights. Decolonizing climate policies is not only about uplifting our voices when it's convenient, but truly respecting self-determination and sovereignty and allowing us to conceptualize our own climate policies and ensuring their inclusion. In this space in particular, Indigenous peoples are continually left out of the room when important decisions are made about our rights and not about how we have a stake in it. My question, therefore, is how are you going to ensure policies here and at home are fair and equitable to Indigenous peoples?
Thank you for the question. I gave the example earlier of the work we did in Kali with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis for the creation of the permanent body. I think it's one example how we are trying to work in partnership with Indigenous peoples internationally. I think you spoke about some of the progress that has been made domestically, but there's still a lot more progress to be made. As some of you may be aware, we have been working for the last 2 years with CERNA, the AFN, Métis Federation, as well as ITK in Canada to try and create basically, the Indigenous Climate Plan. And what would be, for those less familiar, it would basically be a one-stop shop for Indigenous communities and nations in Canada to have access to climate funding for their priorities, for their projects, and the goal still has to be confirmed by cabinet. But Minister Ananda Sangari and I and our departments have been working on this a lot. The goal is to really move away from that colonized model of funding, like project-based initiatives with Indigenous communities, but really moving away from that and giving you the resources that are needed to implement your priorities in the way you see fit. And the idea of the ICL is to have every federal department be part of that. So if a community wants to do a solar project or I don't know what, instead of having to go to NRCan and to ECCC and to Indigenous Services, you would go there and you would be able, all of the federal resources would be pooled in one place. And the mechanism for access, we were talking about access internationally, I think there's a lot to be said about access domestically for Indigenous peoples, then would be facilitated. And we've worked together to co-develop what this would look like. Now, we still evolve in a colonized government where it has to be approved by cabinet, but Minister Nansanguri and I are trying to do justice to our co-development over the last 2 years in presenting this and helping our cabinet colleagues who have not been part of this conversation understand what we're trying to achieve together.
Thank you, Minister. We'll definitely keep tracking that. There's a lot of federal climate policy in development within a moment of urgency that we discussed at the start. And Leila Cantab, our Quebec lead from the CAN-Rac team, has a question on this.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Ministre. Comme Carol vient de dire, there are promising policies still in the work from the government, and I can think of two important regulations, such as the clean electricity regulations, which would help get fossil fuel out of our power grid and shift us to cleaner, more affordable renewables. Also thinking of the draft regulations for the oil and gas emission caps, which was released about a week ago, and which will take, finally take Canada's biggest polluters accountable, although we would need compliance earlier than 2030 for the cap to help achieve Canada's climate target. But we also know that we're still waiting for final regulation for growth, and we also know that federal elections could be called at any time. So we would like to understand, how do you plan to get these policies over the finish line?
Thank you for the question. There is a bit of a misconception about the draft regulations for the oil and gas pollution cap because it doesn't come into force in 2030. Once the final regulations are approved, it will come into force January 1st, 2026, and there are a number of things that companies will need to do starting January 1st, 2026, moving into the first compliant period in 2030, but company won't be able to wait in 2030 to start implementing the necessary measures to comply with the regulations. Otherwise, they won't be able to do it. And as you know, the challenge in our federation is that the federal government doesn't control the use of natural resources. And I know there are many in this room and outside this room who would like Canada to go after production of fossil fuels, which is something we can't do. Both because of the Constitution and certainly for those more legally oriented people in you would have seen the Supreme Court ruling on impact assessment, which told us that we were going too far when it came to implementing climate measures on provincial jurisdiction. So we have this fine line that we need to thread where we can act on pollution, but we can't do through the back door what we can do through the front door. So for example, with the oil and gas emissions cap, if the cap results in direct reduction of production, then this will definitely be challenge in court. And Caroline, we were talking about provincial implementation. We need your help because if you look around the Federation, there aren't a whole lot of provinces that are still on board with things like fighting climate change, putting a price on pollution. So we're doing what we can, but we need your collective help on that. So we need to make sure that for the cap, what we're proposing is technically feasible in terms of emission reduction, regardless of what happens to production. And that's what we've tried to do with the draft regulations, and I'm not saying we got it right. This is why we have a process where we present draft regulations and then we do consultations to make sure that we got it more or less right, and we can make some changes to the final regulations. You will see final regulations on the clean electricity in the coming weeks. So we're getting there. For the CAP, as you know, we have constitutional obligations in terms of consultations with Indigenous peoples, with provinces, with territories. We have obligations consulting experts and civil society, trade unions. This takes time, and it's always this, I don't know if we can call it a dichotomy, but this challenge of wanting to go fast, but at the same time not being told by people, where you're going too fast. We feel that our constitutional rights to be consulted haven't been properly met. So it's a challenge I struggle with on a daily basis. I'm very well aware that there might be a federal election anytime. I would invite you to talk to opposition parties in Canada and tell them that we need those regulations. We need to announce our target by soon. Or we need to choose it by December 1st, and we'll announce it shortly after. We need to deliver on the final clean electricity regulations. We need the methane regulations for 2030, and we need to finalize the oil and gas cap. And certainly think of the Bloc and the NDP who say they care about this. Well, the question to them is, what do you care most about? Do you care more about ensuring that our largest polluters in Canada do their fair share when it comes to tackling climate change and reducing their pollution? Or do they care more about politics? And that's the question I'm posing to them, and I would invite you to pose it to them as well.
Before we go to our last question, just want to react to that, because we have definitely been posing that question. Climate action and climate justice is a non-partisan issue, and I certainly hope that you have seen the help and our efforts to push back against some fossil fuel industry captured provincial politicians, not to name anyone specific. I also want to say that hearing you on the 2030 coming into force, but we would still like to see the formula amended for the cap so that it incentivizes pre-2030 emissions reductions more deeply. For our last question, we'll talk about the intersection of the climate crisis with another crisis that is impacting Canadians back home, and for that, we'll go to Catherine Abreu from the International Climate Politics Club.
Hey, Minister. Thanks so much for opening up COP with a candid conversation with civil society. Great hosting, Kado. So, we're increasingly seeing climate action being pitted against affordability issues in Canada and around the world, as if a livable climate isn't as much of a basic need as affordable housing, transportation, and food. We're also seeing this rise in mis- and disinformation coming up against climate policies, all climate policies, whether it's carbon pricing, clean electricity regulations, and emissions cap. This is happening in Canada, and then in the global context, I'm sure you're experiencing this as well. Interview after interview, I'm being asked, are we still actually going to be seeing international cooperation on climate change, given the geopolitical conflicts and tensions that we're experiencing? So I wonder if you can just, in this final question, reflect a little bit on how we build climate policy that can last, so that it's actually helping and being meaningful to people's lives, and whether international climate cooperation is still going to happen given some of those geopolitical tensions.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. Let's be honest with each other here. There is a wave of populism that is blowing across the globe, and Canada is surely not immune to that. I live this every day when I sit up in the House of Commons, a few meters across from the official opposition. And I don't advise that you watch Question Period too often, but if you want to have a sense of what's happening in terms of the discourse and the disinformation, you just have to watch Question Period for about 10 minutes. And so imagine doing it 6 months a year. How do we deal with this? I think we need to do, and collectively, I'm not pointing fingers here, but I think we need to collectively help Canadians and people around the world better understand why climate action is so essential when talking about things like affordability. The Insurance Bureau of Canada coming out with their reports recently that shows that July and August of 2024 are the costliest month in the history of, 2024, and we're not over 2024, will be the costliest year ever in terms of climate impacts. Now, no one gets a bill at home saying, hey, Kath, this is your share of climate impacts bill this year, but we're all paying for it. But I think because people aren't seeing it this way, that some people don't understand it, and clearly there is a lot of vested interest in this information. On the bright side, we will be, I'm looking at Oliver, we're launching in the coming days, tomorrow, Canada's largest ever climate education campaign in social media. Okay, soon, not tomorrow, soon. The largest ad campaign ever in the history of Canada on climate change. Because obviously we need to counter some of the narrative that is out there by the Conservative Party, and whether federally or in many provinces, and by some of certain lobbies. I don't think that in and of itself will be enough, and we've, as a party, I think we can argue that 2019 was in part fought on carbon pricing, the election, and then 2021, and the Prime Minister is more than happy to have another climate pricing election. He said that many times. So we will do. I think we as a federal government, we can and should be doing a better job, and we're certainly striving to that. But we need civil society to help. We need labor. We need Indigenous nations and communities. It has to be a whole of society effort. And I'm not saying that because I want to try and say that the federal government shouldn't be playing a role. We absolutely need to, but I don't think we will be able to do it alone. And unfortunately, we're losing allies. If you look around, who's supporting carbon pricing provincially? Like even the progressive provincial governments are walking away from pricing, which is, with the exception of Quebec, but pretty much everyone else is. And I know I can't, there's so much more I'd like to say, but time is short. Listen, we've been doing international negotiations for 30 years, and we've had good times and bad times. We've had tough moments before, and we've managed to pull through collectively. What we're trying to do, this endeavor is not about one country or a group of countries, it's about all of us working together and finding solutions in difficult context, and I think we can anticipate that the next few years will be difficult, but we can't give up. Like there's no plan B here. There's no alternative where we say, oh my God, we can't do this. Let's all go back home and forget about it. It's not possible. So it will likely be challenging. It will likely be difficult, and perhaps more than ever, our abilities to talk to each other, despite those challenges, despite those difficulties, I think is needed if we want to achieve the goals that we've set for ourselves.
Thanks for that, Minister. Yeah, I think we can clap. I'm feeling a bit fired up by that last bit, especially on day one of COP. We've covered a lot of ground thanks to the breadth and the diversity of the members and allies of Climate Action Network Canada. Before we close, I wanted to ask you if you have anything you'd like to add or closing remarks.
I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank you all for investing your time, your money, your resources into this. I'm sure you hear it like I do, skepticism, cynicism about, why do this? The UN doesn't work. Remember that 10 years ago, before Paris, we were heading into a world that was going to warm by more than 4 degrees Celsius. And now, because of our collective efforts, we're heading into the warming of somewhere around 2.3 to 2.6. It's still too much, but it's much better than 4, which means that we can do this. If we work together, we can tackle this, but we need to accelerate the pace. We need to do more in terms of financing, in terms of implementation, in terms of mitigation, in terms of adaptation. But it can be done. This idea that it's impossible, I can't accept that, and I can't agree with that. So I want to thank you for your time and efforts in being part of this global effort, and I'm confident that we can do it.
Thank you, Minister. So some final thoughts for me on behalf of the network. I think I've been really struck by your point earlier on this tension between equity and inclusion and speed, because climate change is first and foremost a question of speed. We're in this critical decade, and we have so little time to prevent really the worst impacts of climate change, which are irreversible. But I think what we've been hearing here is that fairness, equity, a just transition are actually a precondition for success. We were talking about how policies are designed in the context of an inflation crisis, and that's really what sticks with me, and I think speaks to this political context that we're in if we want to be able together to design policy in a way that weathers some of the backlash that we're seeing both at home and here internationally. I want you to know, Minister, that the people in this room, including those you haven't heard from, are really they want Canada's leadership, especially in this really critical moment for the Paris Agreement, and are really behind you, not only in Canada's positions in negotiations, but in increasing. Is my mic okay? In increasing ambition towards a COP29 outcome that is just, inclusive, and that really meets the moment that we're in, and thus preserves climate multilateralism. I want to flag that CAN-Rac's policy brief will be published right after this conversation, which outlines our positions and our recommendations for this COP and some of the implementation back home as well that we're seeing. And as always, I come to this now traditional fireside chat with a gift, which I might have lost along the way. Oh, here it is. And this year it is a lanyard that says Global North Pay Up. So thank you so much, Minister.
One little thing.
Yeah.
There's one thing I forgot to say, which I feel is really important on the new financial goal. There are some who are saying, well, maybe we don't do it this time around and it's okay. We can do it next year. And I would strongly push back on that, because I'm afraid, like, if we don't do it this year, you can imagine in so many different ways how it's going to be much more difficult to do next year. And you know what we can agree won't be perfect, and it's unlikely to meet everyone's expectations. But we have to be able to, we can show progress, and that we can move on that here in Baku, despite all of the challenges, because I'm afraid that if we don't get it done here, we're going to be in trouble. Thanks.
Yeah, here on that. So Minister, thanks again, merci encore, and we're looking forward to continued engagement with you and your team, with ECCC throughout this COP. We're really grateful that you took some time on this busy first day with us, and bonne chance, let's do it.